I think we've got a pretty nice group here. So I want to start by saying welcome to everyone and thank you so much for being here today. This is Coffee with a Curator. I'm Aaliyah Vinnick. I'm the events manager at the Science Museum of Minnesota, and I think I've met many of you before. I'm so glad to see you here this morning on this lovely sunny day. And thank you, of course, for your continued support of our mission to make science education accessible to everyone. We're running this program with a few different presenters and just a few Zoom notes before we start. The best way to see our guests is by choosing speaker view in the upper right of your Zoom screen. And a reminder that like all of our programs, we will have time for a Q&A toward the conclusion of Coffee with a Curator today. And you can use the chat window that's in the bottom of your screen to share thoughts and questions that you have. And I was just commenting yesterday, actually, we're all Zoom experts now. So if you do have any questions or concerns, go ahead and chat me privately, but I know you've got this. So to our program today, as many of you know, this month is Women's History Month. And to celebrate and honor women in science, we have a wonderful group of women joining us. I keep telling them that they're the A-team. I think it's going to be a really fun program. So we're going to begin today with Dr. Duchess Harris presenting her research on Black women's contributions to NASA. And then we will have a conversation with women scientists at the Science Museum hosted by our Chair of Science, Lori Fink. So do start thinking about your questions and advice for friends and the young women in your lives who are thinking about careers in science. As I said, we're going to begin today with Dr. Harris. So Duchess Harris is a professor of American Studies at Macalester College and a scholar of contemporary African-American history and political theory. She also holds a Juris Doctorate with an expertise in civil rights law. Dr. Harris is the proud curator of the Duchess Harris Collection, which has more than 40 books written for 3rd to 12th graders, including Hidden Human Computers, The Black Women of NASA, which she will discuss today. Welcome, Dr. Harris.
Thank you so much, Aaliyah. I have to say, I enjoy working with the Science Museum so much. So I'm really glad to be here this morning. I also saw some familiar faces, and so that is delightful as well. I am going to share with you some research that I've done that led to a book that I published in 2017 with my colleague, Sue Bradford Edwards. And as Aaliyah said, it's entitled Hidden Human Computers, The Black Women of NASA. And so just to get started here, most people did not know that Black women worked at NASA until the 2016-17, it came out during the holidays in December, movie Hidden Figures was released. And a lot of people were surprised that it was based on a true story. And of course, here you have Taraji Henson in the middle, who's playing Katherine Johnson. And then Janelle Monáe is on one side, who plays Mary Jackson. And then you have Octavia Spencer. And so this was enlightening for a lot of folk. I can actually say that you know, I had been working on research around this project that predated the movie. And so this is the jacket cover of the book that I was working on as the movie was released. And on the jacket cover here is a woman named Melba Roy Moten, who worked at the Maryland NASA. And if you're not familiar, there are 10 NASA campuses. And we picked this jacket cover because you have the human computer standing next to the newfangled technology of the time, which is the IBM computer. And so I was doing the research, and the story was not unknown to me. In fact, I'd known it my entire life, because this is an image of my maternal grandmother, Miriam Daniel Mann. And so my grandmother, Miriam Daniel Mann, actually started working at the Langley NASA in Hampton, Virginia in 1943. And that's not depicted in the movie. The movie takes place in 61 and 62. And so a lot of people think it's a modern civil rights story, when actually it's a World War II story. And so the way that my grandmother began working at NASA was a little bit about her. She was born in 1907, which was only 40 years after slavery was over. And she was born in Covington, Georgia. She had the opportunity to go to a historically Black college in Alabama called Talladega. She majored in chemistry, and her plan was to be a high school chemistry teacher. However, she ended up marrying my grandfather, who was going to take her back to Virginia to be a faculty wife at what was then called Hampton Institute. When World War II broke out, NASA was looking for white women to do mathematical calculations that the white men had been doing. There weren't enough educated white women at the time to fill the roles. And so they went over to the historically Black college to see if there were Black women who could pass the civil service exam. My grandmother was one of 11, and that is how she started working there when she had 3 children, one who was 8, one who was 7, one who was 6, and the 7-year-old was my mom. And so I'd always been fascinated with this project and was glad to see that the movie was released because it brought attention to this narrative that had been hidden of Black women who were involved in science and space. So the way that I did this work was that I traveled to the grounds of NASA and worked with the archivist. And I like to share this slide because archivists are often hidden. But if they didn't do the work that they did, we wouldn't be able to tell these stories. And so I spent about a week there. I brought a research assistant with me. I also was doing this in collaboration with Margot Lee Shetterly, who did her book, Hidden Figures, which, and then she sold that for the screenplay for Ted Melfi. As we went through the boxes, people often ask me, is there a document that you stumbled upon that really stood out? One document that stood out was the deed to the land for NASA, which indicates here that NASA is actually built on the grounds of Chesterville Plantation. For a Southern historian, this would not be surprising, but for other people, it makes you pause and think about what it would mean for the descendants of people who were formerly enslaved there to actually possibly become NASA employees. And this is not a stretch. My grandfather's family actually was enslaved on the Spotswood plantation, and Spotswood had been the lieutenant governor of Virginia. So all of these narratives are interwoven, and all of that's important to really understand the trajectory of what it took for African Americans to be a part of, the space race. And so it actually wasn't always the space race. NASA was originally NACA, which is the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. The technology at the time was the plane. In fact, when NACA is established in 1915, it's only a few years after the Wright brothers have taken their first flight. It's also when Woodrow Wilson is president. And I bring that up not just because I'm a historian nerd, but the significance that Wilson is a segregationist and really did not have a vision for NACA to ever be desegregated. And so, there's a lot that transpires in the nation between World War I and World War II. So if we fast forward to World War II, this is when Franklin Delano Roosevelt is president. And he feels a lot of pressure with domestic civil rights to do something, but not something that's too much, that's going to disrupt the nation in the midst of war. And so what he does is sign Executive Order 8802. This desegregates federal jobs. And one of the reasons why this is so important is because it allows women like my grandmother to take this position. And so this is a clip from a Black newspaper called the Norfolk Journal and Times. As you can see, it says, paving the way for women engineers. This generation of women do not become engineers. It isn't until Mary Jackson, who's played by Janelle Monáe in the movie, in the 1960s that they're able to get engineering training. The irony about what human computers did is that they were women who checked the math of engineers. So the men were allowed to be engineers, but the women were smart enough to check the math, but not allowed to be engineers. And so I have on my slide here the pay discrepancy. The men who were junior engineers made $2,600 a year. The Black women who checked their math made $1,400 a year. The lack in pay equity. Well, this week was Equal Pay Day. We still struggle with that in America. Even though it looks like such a huge discrepancy, something to understand is that this was the highest paying job that a Black woman could have at the time. Just so you know, you could purchase a single family home at the time for less than the $2,600 that the men engineers were making. So as I move forward, because I could talk about this all day, but I probably have about 5 minutes, I just want to say that Black women were able to get enough education to become human computers because they worked at historically Black colleges. A lot of people weren't that familiar with historically Black colleges until we got Kamala Harris as our vice president. A lot of people talked about her going to Howard University. Historically Black colleges opened the gates for Black women to get education. And so the college that the women who worked at the Langley NASA were affiliated with was Hampton. And I mentioned that is where my grandmother sat in the privileged position of being a faculty wife. And just for some information, it's the alma mater of Booker T. Washington. And so how does NACA become NASA, right? Because how do you move from planes to entering the space race? As we go through history, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik. This is a political moment because we're gearing up for the 1960 presidential election. John F. Kennedy is running. He promises that he's going to get men into outer space. The US feels very competitive. They don't want to be behind the Soviet Union. And so the National Defense Education Act is passed. And that puts millions of dollars of funding into NACA so that it can transition into becoming NASA. And so just briefly, there are a lot of Black women that, of course, aren't highlighted in the Hollywood film, such as Annie Easley and others who do important work to make sure that we end up being competitive in the space race as a nation. The tension between the human computers and the machines was that these Black women who were able to get such great salaries didn't want to become obsolete. They didn't want to be replaced by the IBM. And so they took the initiative to learn Fortran, which was the language to program the machines. And so as I close out, I want people to keep in mind that NASA actually had a more progressive politic than some other federal agencies, partly because they started reaching out to Black employees a lot earlier than some other spaces did. And so they were involved in the civil rights movement. They created equal employment opportunity positions in their space of work. And this is a blueprint of the space in NASA where people used to eat. And what I have here in purple, if it were a larger image, you would see that it originally says colored dining. And they end up integrating the dining in the early 1960s. And so NASA does a marketing campaign where they decide in the 1960s it will be important to recruit more employees. They decide that their spokeswoman should be Michelle Nichols. I have two images up here because some people remember what she looked like when she played Lieutenant Uhura on Star Trek. The older picture is what she looks like now. And she actually attracted African Americans to the workspace to get them interested even more in being a part of this. And so I'll close out by saying that the work that she does in the 60s and 70s really is inspiring for someone like Mae Jemison, who ends up being the first Black woman astronaut. And this happens in the mid 1980s. And so I'm glad to be here this morning. I just want to say with you all that originally when I started doing this work, I felt that this was my story. And so this is an image of my late grandparents sitting on the sofa. They're flocked by my uncles. The sassy teenager on the pillow is my 85-year-old mom. What I ended up realizing, however, is that, you know, after you get the Hollywood film and people become more intrigued with this, it isn't just my family story. It's actually a story for everyone. So I have to say to Aaliyah, thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. I hope I didn't go over time, and I'm going to share the mic.
Thank you so much. That was just fantastic. I've seen your presentation before, and it always fills me with ideas and questions. So for those of you who are feeling the same way in the audience, hold your questions for now, or you can go ahead and chat them, but we'll have a Q&A towards the end. And now I want to move from a historic story to some of our panelists who are making careers in science today. And to host our panel today, I would like to introduce our Chair of Science, Lori Fink. Lori leads and manages staff in the museum's Center of Research and Collections, which is a group of scientists and collections professionals. This means that Lori oversees the groups that do fossil digs, archaeology digs, water quality, sampling, collections management, and so much more. As the Chair of Science, Lori aims to engage the public in the fascinating world of science. Before coming to the museum as an exhibit developer and science liaison, she worked in the biotechnology industry and obtained her PhD from the University of Minnesota in pharmacology. Welcome, Lori.
Thanks, Aaliyah, and thanks, Duchess. I just have to say, wow, and I can't wait to read your book, especially with my kids, so thank you very much. As the Chair of Science at the Science Museum in Minnesota, I have the pleasure of working with some really exceptional scientists who also happen to be women. In fact, 10 of the 23 people who work in the Center of Research and Collections identify as women. And this is notable because I've worked in environments where I'm the only woman or one of very few in the room. And I can tell you that it's hard and it's lonely to be in that position. And that's why I'm really excited to be here today to have this conversation with these very accomplished professionals. In addition to Dr. Duchess Harris, who you've just met, we are joined by museum scientist Joy Ramstek. Joy has a master's degree in geological sciences, and for the past 15 years, she has worked at the museum's St. Croix Watershed Research Station. And in addition to her work with the museum, she holds a research scientist position at Evergreen State College in Washington and runs STEM conferences for middle school girls. We're also joined by Science Museum of Minnesota's Board of Trustee member, Dr. Jayshree Seth. When she isn't volunteering for the museum, Dr. Seth is a corporate scientist at 3M and is also the 3M's first ever Chief Science Advocate, which is a really cool title. And she has a PhD in chemical engineering with 72 patents on a variety of innovations. So welcome, and welcome back, Duchess. I'm so happy to have the three of you here. So to start, it would be great if each of you would just share a little bit more about yourself and how you got to where you are today. And if you don't mind, Jayshree, to go first on this one.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. That was a great presentation by Dr. Harris. It was very interesting to see, walk through all the history. As far as my history, I literally had to cross oceans to land here, no kidding. I grew up in India and I came to US for graduate school, and I did my master's and PhD at Clarkson University in upstate New York. And then I came to 3M as a summer intern. And they offered me a job. So I went back, I graduated, and I joined 3M as a full-time employee. And I've been here for almost 28 years. In this time, I've risen to the highest level you can attain as a scientist at 3M, which is called corporate scientist. And in 2018, I was asked to take on this additional role that you said was cool. So that made me very happy. It's called Chief Science Advocate. And this role came about because we did a global survey called State of Science Index. And we realized that science needs advocates. Science needs champions when we saw what the global perception of science was. And I was honored that they asked me to take this role on. And I say that because I never thought of myself as a science and engineering type when I was growing up. I just wanted to help people solve problems, improve lives, and I just couldn't see the connection with STEM fields. But now I know that science helps people, scientists improve lives, and it's such a human endeavor. And now I know that it is one that we can bring our whole self in. So I'm really happy to have stepped into this cool role and spreading the word about science.
Thank you very much. Joy, would you be willing to share your story?
Sure. Thanks, Lori. Good morning, everyone. It's really fun to be here, and it was great to hear Dr. Harris's talk. I'm currently a research scientist here at the museum, and my research program revolves around using lake sediments to study recent environmental change. In fact, I work with diatoms in the sediments, which is Aaliyah's background this morning, which is pretty cool. And in reflecting on this question, I've realized that many or most of the professional choices I've made have been steered by the amazing mentors that I've had. And overall, I feel like I can view my path in a lot of different ways. I could tell a story of how one interest led me to the next. And while that would be true, I think it's also important to view my path in terms of how I've gravitated towards people who have inspired and supported me. I entered college with a general interest in science, but pretty unsure what I wanted to do beyond that. And I had a very enthusiastic ecology professor, which was really the reason I first gravitated to ecology and environmental science. And he really helped fuel this passion for doing research. And then I was fortunate to have a wonderful advisor in graduate school. And I feel I've been successful in this field in a large part because of the confidence she instilled and the connections she made for me. And in fact, I eventually landed at the Science Museum due to connections I forged while working in her lab. And here at the museum, I've worked with great people, received a lot of encouragement along the way. I've been given the freedom to pursue interests outside of research, such as science education and outreach. And Lori, in fact, has been a really great mentor in that regard. And I love the work I do here. And one of the things that's really helped keep me here is the flexibility that I've been afforded in this position. For example, I've been able to reduce my hours while having a young child. And while doing that, I've retained my professional position and not felt like I've been losing ground. And from what I've seen, lack of this kind of flexibility can often edge women out of professional positions. And so I hope that workplaces can really continue to adopt these kind of flexible measures. And so all of this really makes me realize the importance of mentoring and how easily those from less privileged backgrounds can get boxed out of that. And so I really try to keep these things in mind and do my part to support those who are entering or who are looking to enter the field.
Thank you, Joy. That was great. Thanks. And Duchess, would you please share a little bit how you got to where you are today?
Sure. I mean, my journey is different because I'm not actually in science. But what I'm trained to do is uncover stories. And what inspires me is telling stories about Jayshree and Joy. Like, that's what I do, is that I find women in all kinds of fields, but obviously I write about women in science as well, and tell young people. And it isn't just young girls. Like, what I have found that's interesting is when you tell young boys about accomplished women, they realize that women can be authority figures and that you can look up to women. And then when you share stories about Joy and Jayshree to people, they realize, to girls, they realize that they can do that. And so that's what my journey has been, is to really try to unveil the work of women that's happening that we just don't know about.
Thank you. That is so great. And it's so wonderful to have storytellers like you, Duchess. That's really good. So for the next question, and I really appreciate hearing all of your stories because it just clarifies that none of us have a single path and that there's these windy things that you don't know what's going to lead to the next thing. And had someone told me 20 years ago that I was going to become a museum professional instead of a bench scientist, I would have said, no, you're so wrong. And here I am. So it's just great to hear all of these stories. Would each of you please elaborate a bit on an experience along the way that really shaped you or made a really big impact on you? And Joy, do you want to start with this one?
Sure. So before coming to the Science Museum, I spent a lot of time at universities as an undergraduate, a graduate student, and then a couple of different university research positions I held after graduate school. In each of those places, I was in a mix of either biology or geology, environmental science type departments. And I think in these disciplines, I've encountered more women than I would have if I was in sort of a physics or engineering department. But however, while my cohort, so being students or younger research assistants, that cohort was generally a good mix of men and women, but the faculty was almost exclusively male, with some exceptions, but really only a handful. And the faculty who were women were often at the top of their field, and I felt there was a bit of a feeling like they had to be the very best in order to have earned that position. And so that's something that I do feel is slowly changing. I've witnessed more women from my graduate school cohort enter faculty positions, but I still think we have a ways to go to really balance things out. And kind of getting back to how this has shaped me, as a graduate student, I was lucky to be in the lab of one of the 2 female faculty members in the department. She was amazing, and I think there was something really important about working closely with her and seeing a female in that role that really helped instill me with confidence at a really critical point in my career. One other thing I would quickly touch on, it's not a single experience per se, but the observations I've made throughout my career about the differences in communication styles between men and women. When I've worked in more male-dominated groups, I often witness male voices coming across more confident, females sometimes having a hard time making their voice heard or being taken seriously. And, we can tell women to speak up, we can tell women to make their voice heard. And of course, that's important. But in my opinion, it's also very difficult to fundamentally alter your style of communication. So I think what's even more important is striving for that gender balance in the workplace and work groups. I personally don't find communication is as much of an issue when work groups have a gender balance. I think people are becoming more aware of this, and I see people designing meetings where everyone has a voice. And so I feel like we're making strides here, and I hope we continue.
Sorry, I have to actually unmute so you can hear me. Thank you, Joy. Duchess, would you please share an experience?
Sure. When I was an undergraduate, I attended the University of Pennsylvania, and I had the opportunity to meet this woman named Mary Frances Berry. And she is a Black woman who has a JD PhD. And I had never heard of such. I couldn't hold 2 ideas in my head at the same time. My thought was like, obviously you just have one or the other. And to see her navigate the world, she would commute between Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. on the train because she was a civil rights commissioner. She had been originally appointed by Carter. And then when Reagan was elected, she was removed from the post. And then, by the time I was in college, she'd found her way back in, even though it was still the Reagan Bush years. Understand, she sued the federal government and won. Fascinating, right? And so I was just inspired by watching her. I learned a lot from her in terms of content, but it was really how she was in the world that impacted me. And so I realized that even though I came from the fortunate position that obviously I had people in my family who'd been to college, right, as far back as like the 1920s, it didn't mean I had seen someone like her. And so it made me realize the impact of paying it forward, and how sometimes young people just want to talk to you. And to always, even though I'm very busy, to stop and pause and do that, and understand how important that is.
Thank you, Duchess. That's great. Jayshree, do you want to share an experience?
Well, I already mentioned I didn't think of myself as the science and engineering type, but I actually grew up on the campus of a premier engineering institution. My dad is a PhD engineer himself. He was a university professor. So my parents strongly encouraged us to go into engineering, but I didn't get admission into the prestigious hometown institute. So I ended up thousands of miles away from home in a different part of the country. And it was different language, different culture, different social norms. So that became an early experience that taught me coping skills to live, to survive, and eventually thrive. And that's a skill that has helped me in good stead and built resilience. So when I came to the US as a 21-year-old to pursue graduate school, and when I ended up with a master's project that I didn't necessarily feel excited about, and in looking back, it was just because I couldn't see the human context that I didn't realize at the time how important that was for me. So I actually made a big move. I switched fields from my master's to my PhD. And this became really a crucible experience again, another one for me, I would say, because I had to start all over. And I found that because I could build a context around that project, I was so inspired. And that experience shaped my thinking. And when I ended up at 3M, it was again in a completely different area. My PhD has been in diamond-like films, and I ended up working on fasteners for disposable diapers. So I went from diamonds to diapers. But deep down, by that time, I knew I will be fine because I've done this before. Somewhere deep down, I realized I've gone into a new field, I've been okay. I've gone into a new environment, I've been okay. I've gone to a new country, and I've been okay. So what is great is that I ended up in this culture of innovation at 3M where empowerment and collaboration were embedded in everything we do. And I had wonderful peers and amazing bosses who shaped me, but they were also willing to be shaped by me. And I realized that I may not have had a specific expertise, but I had this knack for identifying the problems to solve, developing a context around them because that's what I needed. And I could keep that community-oriented mindset to inform, to influence, to inspire, and then collaborate with people to solve them. And that is what I call the art of applying science to life. And that has shaped my life experiences, including everything, work, etc., which is all part of life to me.
Thank you. Thank you to all three of you. And I'm seeing this theme of role models, mentors, people who helped us get through difficult positions. And I think back to when I was a chemistry student at the U, and I actually had other female chemistry students say, don't put your first name on the test, just put your first initial and your last name, and that's going to make a difference. And it's those little things that, in one hand, horrify me, but I see as a help along the way as well. And so it's just great to hear these stories from each of you. For our last question, before we open it up to everybody else, I wonder if you could reflect on something that either really helped you or you wish that would help you, that we could all then take as something to help future female scientists, engineers, history professors, just to help encourage women to get into your profession along the way. And Duchess, would you start this question?
Sure. I mean, all of my mentors were out of state when I took my job at Macalester. I am the first Black woman to be promoted from assistant to associate to full since 1874. And so I didn't have anyone on campus to turn to. I see the looks of surprise. You know, it's a small campus. There are about 150 faculty. It's a small campus. So what I would like to pay forward is that there are 3 Black women on the faculty now who are untenured. You know, so I feel like having a buddy of sorts in your space would be valuable as we move forward. But if that is not there, I encourage people to look elsewhere. And so I have these networks that are absolutely everywhere, because that was the only way I was going to understand what to do. It's like putting your first initial on. I had, you know, I had no idea what to do. And I really didn't know who to ask. When I joined the faculty, there were only 11 white women who were full professors. And they were all like my parents' age. And so like when Joy talked about work-life balance, like they either had not had kids or like started their careers after they had it, like none of it matched up. And so that's what I would like moving forward, is for us to lift as we climb.
That's great. Thank you. Jayshree, do you want to add to that?
Well, if I look at my own story, I say for all the girls who want to change the world and solve real problems that matter, I say to them, we need you. We need more people with community-oriented goals and aspirations in STEM than ever before, with all the sustainability challenges we have ahead of us. To all the young women who wonder if they should consider STEM or leave STEM because humanities may feel more intuitive and they feel like it's either or, I give them my spiel, mark my words, the real shtick is STEM, science, humanities, technology, engineering, and math. That's really the secret to my success. So bring that much needed mindset. For all the professional women in STEM or those who are poised to start, and if they're wondering if a corporate career, can they succeed in it? I want to tell them you can change the rubric. You must alter the metrics and you will transform the optics, just like Professor Harris did at Macalester. And it's about, you know, defeating these stereotypes really of who goes in or persists or excels in STEM. Don't let those pervasive stereotypes deter you. Come on and join us, because if anything, hashtag 2020, the year of change, has taught us is that things need to change. But to change the field of science, you don't need to change. The point is science needs you to be you. So I can't wait to see how you will change the world for the better.
Thank you. That was so inspiring. I appreciate it. Joy, do you have last thoughts on how we can change the field of STEM?
Sure. So I've spoken to some of the things that have helped me along the way, but one thing that I feel was lacking as I was going through was exposure to STEM careers. In some ways, I feel like I was taught science in a vacuum and had very little appreciation or understanding for the breadth of STEM careers that were available. I even felt that way leaving college. I felt like I still lacked an appreciation for all the ways that I could apply my degree. And I do think this is changing. And I love that there are so many opportunities for young women to be exposed to STEM and STEM careers. I see so many programs for young kids that I think it's great to take advantage of. And I don't think they existed 20 or 30 years ago. I mean, my elementary school age daughter takes this after school Lego engineering class and she loves it. For the last 5 or 6 years, I've helped to run an event to help expose middle school girls to careers in science. There's been a lot of research that's shown that it's sort of this middle school age when girls really start to opt out and shy away from STEM classes. So giving them some space to learn about STEM careers and hands-on all-female environment has felt really powerful. And I love this event, and I watch girls that learn that STEM careers they're not just lofty and abstract, but they're attainable, and there are women in their community who are working in these fields. And a few years ago, I was spending a bunch of time working on this event, and I kept talking, my daughter kept hearing me talk about girls in science, and she very seriously said to me, you know, boys can do science too, they can. And so it made me remember that there's no reason that our girls have to lose that confidence that they have when they're little. They don't need to lose it because they're female. They don't need to lose the confidence because of the color of their skin. So my wish is that we can all do our part to raise a generation of girls whose biggest concern is that they're leaving the boys out of science.
That was a great message to end on. Thank you, Joy. And I now want to hand this over to Aaliyah, who will moderate the questions for everybody.
Oh, I just feel so inspired. Thank you, everyone, for your thoughts and your reflections and experiences. I feel like we could do a whole program with each and every one of you. And as always, as I feared, we're tight on time, but we do have time for a few questions. And we have one, if you want to go ahead and chat your question right into the chat window. Thanks again to all of our panelists. And we already have one question from one of my colleagues. And actually, I was thinking about this too. Some of you talked about the human context around science, and that sort of, I think also that lift as we climb idea. So the question is, do you think the human context around science is a woman thing? Do you see your male colleagues needing that? And actually, I might start that one. Jayshree, can I throw that one to you first? All right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I really have experienced this firsthand. I know this is data point of 1, but I have a son and a daughter. And for my son, content was enough. For my daughter, it was always the context. So I think there is part of the evolutionary construct that perhaps drives this desire for context and a bigger picture than just focusing on the what, but the why and the how and all of that. But I will point out that I'm also seeing a lot of the younger generation, boys and girls, very motivated by the context of a higher purpose. And so part of me feels that we just laid out STEM in a very sort of male-centric fashion initially, because that's all there was to it. And it became very content-focused. But we need to take a step back and make it more about the context, because now in the next generation, it inspires everybody, because then it gives you a nice Venn diagram with your sense of purpose and what you're doing and why you're doing it and the legacy that you want to leave behind. So I think it's time for us to focus more on that context. And it is a great context. In fact, that is the story we need to tell. And we're missing out on so many creative ideas if we just focus on the content.
Anyone else want to comment on that question or share any input?
I completely, oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I completely agree. And I also feel this is where we have to expose children to the breadth of what you can do in STEM. You don't just have to be a doctor or an astronaut. There are a lot of things to do in STEM. And I think sort of opening that up and seeing how your particular interests can feed into so many different things, not just this sort of lab coat sort of image that we have when we think STEM.
That's really helpful input.
Sorry, Laurie, I cut you off.
So I feel so, okay. So the next question, and actually I'm going to throw this one to Jayshree to start too, because you talked about this idea of shtick, or the STEM in STEM. And Nan asks, what role do you think the arts have in promotion and understanding of science, especially for girls?
I think very important. In fact, I'll quote an example from Carnegie Mellon. I think they have an outreach unit, which basically took little robots that you could program. When you take them to the science classes, as Joy mentioned, the girls will opt out. You take it to the English class and you say, now you have to program the emotion of the bear. The girls didn't even think twice that they had to program, because they were just driven by showing how sad the bear was because of the story that was going on. So it may be that we have to get creative in the way we address this to get more women, girls, underrepresented minorities in science through that arts piece, but also the larger humanities aspect of it. which is all the sciences that are in humanities and all the social sciences that can straddle really well. And the point that I want to make there is 2020, and let's say we're on month 15 of 2020, we see how this plays out, where social sciences are so critical for us in fighting the pandemic. So you may have the science, you may have the scientific policy, you may have the science solutions, and we all await the gift of science, but it's the social sciences about human psychology and the humanities and those aspects and the history of what has happened before, that is critical. So I think science will only excel if you pull in the humanities, and that's when you will be allowed to really offer up to the public what you really think science has to offer. So I think the intersection of the two and pulling in all these fields from a contextual perspective is critical. It truly is critical.
Other comments from our panel?
I mean, I have a comment about the art promoting the understanding. And I'll say that, you know, academics can be purists. And so when the Hollywood movie came out, there were people in academia that said, you know, well, what we need is a documentary. And I love documentary. But what I know is that people going and participating in the art of film, right, are captured by that. And so to see Octavia Spencer playing Mrs. Dorothy Vaughan, right? And, you know, my family knew Mrs. Vaughan. And I had been researching about her for like a decade before that film. It was the film that drew people into the research. And my field is very difficult to translate to the public. Oh, you know, I know about Black women mathematicians at NASA. That doesn't really sound too jazzy until all of a sudden Pharrell does like the musical score for the film. And then people are like, oh, look at that. And then when you think about, then Mattel jumps on and they're like, we're gonna have dolls, right? And I'm telling you, my son was 10 when my book came out, and he could have cared less about my book. And then he goes to his 5th grade class and tells his 5th grade class, this is very similar to what Joy was saying about her daughter doing, you know, the Lego project. He saw the Hidden Figures Legos, and he told his 5th grade class that his grandmother was a Lego. He was undone, right? I've been trying to tell him this story his whole life. And so I think the way that the art intersects with this is critical, because this is what human beings often respond to.
It's all about the stories.
I was going to say, if I could echo that, traditionally academia is very siloed, and you just do your chemistry, you just do your pharmacology or whatever. And that's starting to change a little bit, but it's so true that we need to mix all of these different expertise, which is why it's important for people of color, girls, women, to all get involved and bring our lived experiences to the problem solving, because it's going to be so much better. And I mean, look at your background, Aaliyah. Science is beautiful. I mean, those are the diatoms that Joy looks at as part of her research, and we need to remember that. And I think about what Jayshree was saying. My kids went to a magnet school that was art and science, and so they would learn about a topic in their social studies class, in their art class, in their science class, and it would go throughout all of that, because that's how we are as humans, and it's really important to remember that.
Great words. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Joy. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to also add too that I really agree that it's so important to be weaving these different disciplines together and exposing kids, because even kids who aren't going to later gravitate towards the sciences, it's so important that they have a basic understanding of the sciences. I mean, when we think about things like climate change and the current pandemic we're under, we need a scientifically literate public. And we need people who science might not be their thing, but they're comfortable with it and they've had that exposure. So I think it's really important from that perspective too.
Absolutely. Thank you all so very much. This has just been a really wonderful morning, and I'm just delighted to hear from each and every one of you. And I'm so glad all of you on the call could join us. And I bet that you're all thinking about advice that you might give to some young people who are thinking about their careers now too. I hope you are, because I'm about to give you a little audience participation prompt. I want to hand it over to Jayshree because she has a special treat for us today. So I'm going to go ahead and pop up a slide here. Jayshree, do you want to say a few words about this book that you've created?
Thanks, Aaliyah. Yep, I've actually compiled a lot of my reflections and insights and tips into my recent book. Here it is. It's called The Heart of Science: Engineering Footprints, Fingerprints, and Imprints. And I hope the readers can take away at least two things for sure. First is, what is really at the heart of a science journey? Because there are a lot of misconceptions out there about what science is, what scientists do. And I want to let women and underrepresented minorities and young folks know that just because you think you have pro-social goals and a community-oriented mindset and you want to change things around you and make the world a better place, that STEM is not for you. It is for you, because those goals of helping people and improving lives have been at the center of my journey, and I talk about that in the book. And secondly, I want to let them know that it's just not about where you reach and what you did, but also how you do it. And it's going to become more and more critical part of our legacy, how we approach things and how inclusive we are. So I give a lot of examples from my career and my thoughts and reflections and insights, and give points to ponder to hopefully inspire others, because I believe the footprints and the fingerprints matter, but also the imprints, which is the mark you leave on hearts and minds. So I think it'll be great if you can put in the chat one thing you can do or one piece of advice that you can give to women in STEM, girls who are moving towards that, or women who are moving towards that profession. So if you can put in the chat at least one thing.
Yeah, and so to Jayshree's point, we have 10 copies of this. I don't know if you can see it because of my background, but we have 10 copies of this book that we're giving away today to some of you on this call. And if there's a lot of interest, we will definitely give priority to those people who drop an interesting little nugget of advice for young women into the chat here. Otherwise, we'll just kind of randomly select from our guests and follow up with you to send you this book. But I also put a link to it in the chat on Amazon. So I'll give you a few minutes to do that. I did want to mention too that Hidden Human Computers by Duchess Harris is also available for sale at our stores. So the next time you come to visit us at the museum, you can check that out. I'll be watching the chat for a few more comments from all of you, but I wanted to again thank our panel for joining us and thank all of you for joining us. And as we're wrapping and as people are chatting to us, I did want to show you a couple of other things. And of course, now my slideshow's acting up. Okay, so as we're wrapping up here, I wanted to mention a few events that we have coming up. We have a lot of things happening in April. So next month, we first of all hope to see you at our Earth Day themed science celebration event. And that's the slide that I have up. We just put up our ticketing site today, and you can learn more about what we're doing. But our featured speaker is Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. She's a marine biologist who talks about the intersection of climate and equity. And we're also going to have some really fun breakouts with some of our scientists on staff talking about research around climate for Earth Day. And then the following week on April 29th, we're going to do our next coffee with the Curator, and also to tie into our Action for Earth initiative that'll be focusing on sustainability and agriculture. So we hope to see you for both of those and watch for some email invites. I see some little chats coming in here, so I will follow up with those of you who shared some of your thoughts and advice for young women entering in the science field. And until then, I want to say thank you again to all of our panelists. So thank you to Dr. Duchess Harris, Jayshree Seth, Dr. Lori Kleinbaum, Fink, and of course, Joy Hobbs. Your thoughts and insights were just really valuable. So thanks to all of you for joining us, and have a wonderful morning.